Hey guys, so I had a comment on one of my YouTube videos today from somebody who's a chess beginner and was asking which pieces should I move at the start of the game? Should I push a lot of pawns? Should I move pawns around? Or should I try and move my bigger pieces? Okay, so I thought I'd do a short video on the absolute basics and fundamentals of opening theory. So you don't need to remember a load of different openings, right? But if you remember the principles that I'm going to tell you in this video, you will do very well. So I'm going to play a game against one of the chess.com bots. I've chosen Laura, that's rated around 1100. Okay, so first things first, what are you trying to achieve in the opening? What is your objective? Well, what you want to do is, right now at the beginning of the game, your pieces are all kind of safe, all at home, okay, and so are your opponent's pieces. So no one's threatening or attacking each other, and you're not going to win a game of chess by not threatening your opponent. So what you want to do is you want to get your pieces into the board, and preferably into the middle of the board, the center, which is like the prime real estate, because pieces in the center of the board have a lot more scope to move around and can control more squares. They can look at more squares. And generally you'll want to move your minor pieces into the board first. Your minor pieces are your knights and your bishops. Now, you will notice that knights can jump over pawns and jump over other pieces, so they can jump into the game at any time. Your bishops, however, are both blocked in by pawns. So a pawn is going to have to move for each bishop to move. Now this bishop's on dark squares, so one of these pawns on dark squares is going to have to move in order for this bishop to get out into the board in any way. Likewise with your light squared bishop, it's blocked in by two pawns that start the game on light squares. So you're going to have to move one of these light squared pawns and one of these dark squared pawns towards the start of the game in order to get your bishops out into the board. Because right now these bishops are attacking nothing. They can only move on squares that are already occupied by their own pieces, right? But a bishop that's out, say, in the middle of the board can attack lots of different things, okay? And it can also defend other squares behind it. So that's a useful bishop. Likewise a knight. Right now this knight here is only looking at 1, 2, 3 squares, okay? But if this knight was out in the middle of the board, say here, then suddenly it's looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares. So that's a much more powerful knight. So we're going to have to move 2 pawns. So one thing to remember is you don't want to be moving pawns more frequently than you have to. So you have to move 2 in order to get your bishops out, in order to complete development and complete the opening phase of the game. So you don't want to be moving pawns that you've already moved. You don't want to be moving too many pawns unless you absolutely have to. And you also don't want to be moving pieces that you've already moved into the board more than once unless you absolutely have to. The reason is because every time you make a move, that's a turn of yours that you are not using to complete development. Okay, so the first phase of the game is to get your minor pieces out into the board and to try and control the center. So with this move, e4, I'm now controlling these two. Oops. Okay, so let's start. So I'm going to move pawn to e4. And with this move, I'm controlling 2 squares. Now, my opponent Laura has responded with pawn to e5. So this pawn is now controlling those 2 squares. So far, so good. Now, I can develop my queen can come out into the board, but I don't want to move my queen yet until I've finished developing my minor pieces. So let's move a knight out now. And my opponent corresponds with moving a knight out. So with this move, I actually attacked her pawn on e5. So she's responded by moving this knight out here to defend the same pawn, and that makes sense. So now let's move my bishop out. My king's bishop comes out. Now this happens to be called the Italian game, but it's completely principled, right? So my opponent does a similar thing, moves there. bishop out into the board. Now I could castle. Go castle straight away at this point. And now my king is safe. Also, the other thing that castling does is it liberates your rook. Whereas your rook starts the game in a corner completely blocked in by its other pieces, castling can mean that this rook can now possibly play a role, an important role in the game. So my opponent has just moved knight here to f6, and that's attacking this pawn here that is currently undefended. So what options have I got for defending that pawn? I could, for example, move my bishop back to d3, but that breaks one of our principles because you don't want to move pieces that you've already developed a second time. Okay, so that's not a good idea. I could move my knight there to g5 where it's protecting the pawn, but again, that's a second move of a developed piece, so I don't want to do that. I could move my knight to c3. Now that's a good move. Okay, and it defends the pawn and it develops a piece. So that's a good idea. Another option might be to push d3. Okay, now by pushing d3, I'm defending the pawn and I'm also opening up this diagonal for my bishop. So I'm going to go ahead and play d3. And my opponent does similar. So now they've opened up possibilities for their light square bishop. And now let's I'm going to bring out my bishop to here. Okay, so it's come out into the board, it's putting pressure on the knight, and it also pins the knight, which means that the knight now cannot move because I would then be able to capture black's queen, and that would be very, very bad for black. So black has now used a pawn move in order to kick my bishop, right? Now that's a move that black has now used instead of maybe developing their final minor piece. So I can just drop my bishop back here. Okay, so I'm moving a developed piece a second time, but I had to do it because it was under attack. Okay, so sometimes you have to break away from your plan to develop in order to do something tactical, as in save material, which I've done here. Now black has moved another pawn. So if you see, black has now moved 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns in their first 7 moves, right? I have moved 1, 2 pawns only. And what this now means is that I can play, for example, I'll just develop my other knight to c3. So I'm now slightly ahead, okay, because all my minor pieces are now out into the board, whereas black still has a bishop that's undeveloped and still hasn't castled, right? So I've got all my minor pieces out into the board and I've castled on move 8. Okay, now another pawn move threatens my bishop again, but it's not a huge threat because I can just move to here. So one thing that I notice now is that where is black's king going to go? So I think castling and putting the king on g8, that doesn't look very good to me at all, because this pawn has already moved now twice and is all the way up the board, so that leaves a big hole in front of the king. You don't want to do that. Now, is the king going to castle this side? Well, it could do. It would be better than castling kingside. However, before that can happen, black's got to move that bishop and move that queen out of the way. So black is already behind in terms of development. So now, obviously, this pawn is attacking my knight, but maybe I can improve my knight's prospects in the game. I do need to move it, so where can I go? I can't go there because the pawn could take me. So that's an option. I can't take that pawn because it's guarded by another pawn. I can't go there because it's guarded by 3 pieces. Or I could go here. Okay, so which is the better move? And I think keeping my knight towards the center of the board is generally more advisable. I might want to consider this, but knights on the rim are dim, so they don't have great prospects. I'm going to move it back to d2. And now I've just about completed development. All I need to do now is get my queen off of the back rank. Okay, and then, so let's move my queen here. And now you can see that my rooks are now connected, right? The rooks are looking at each other, they're defending each other, and my king is nice and safe, tucked away in that corner. Right, now black has for some reason moved their king. I guess one reason for that could be to protect this h6 pawn, seeing as there's nothing else that can protect it. If the g pawn was back on g2, it would be protecting the pawn, but black has thrown this pawn up the board now. So now I can think about, now development is complete, I can think about maybe attacking black. So I'm going to start with pushing my pawn to f3. This is no, I can't do that. Haha, it wouldn't let me. Because I've noticed there, the dark squared bishop would then have my king in check. So we can't have that. So, what else can I do? I can't capture this pawn because it's defended by the knight and this bishop as well. So, but I really do want to open up some space to attack this king with. So I'm just going to pop my king over to h1 and then I can proceed with my plan. Okay, here comes another pawn move, completely unnecessary pawn move. Okay, so let's play f3 now. Now bishop comes out. This bishop is defended by that knight that I moved to d2, so I'm not concerned about that. Let's now capture the pawn. So now what I've done is I've opened up some space towards black's position where black's king is. Now the bishop's recaptured and it's attacking my queen. So let's move the queen. And the only safe space to move the queen to is there. So sometimes you just have to do the right thing to respond to your opponent's threats. Okay, now I'm not liking this dark squared bishop looking down there because my queen wants to come onto these squares. And I've got a bit of a crossfire going on with these bishops. So I want to do something about that. I want to get rid of them. So how can I get rid of this dark squared bishop, for example? I could play b4 and try and kick it back, but then it could just drop back to either of these squares and it's still a danger. What about the light squared bishop? Can I make life difficult for that one? Okay, well I have h3, that would kick the bishop for sure. And it's just moved back, okay, again to h5. Now still the big issue with this board setup right now is that my king is relatively safe in the corner, whereas black's king is way out in the open. So what can I do about this? So now we're in the middle game. Now I'm looking at what pieces are defended, what pieces are undefended, and starting to think about tactical ideas of how I can start to get into my opponent's position. So now I'm going to move my knight back to f3. It's blocking off this bishop. If the bishop captures, I could recapture with the rook and that would be fine. But now I'm going to improve my knight. I don't want to leave my knight on h4. It doesn't belong on h4. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move it here. And that is now checking black's king. And it's put my knight on the 5th rank, a really nice position for the knight. So this is starting to look a bit more threatening. Now I'm going to drop my bishop back and see if what black's intentions are with their dark square bishop. Okay, he's moved it away. I'm going to remove black's dark squared bishop because it's a dangerous piece. Okay, black now has doubled pawns on the c-file. My knight is under attack, but I don't have to respond to that right now. I'm just going to put my queen here. That would be an idea. I could also think about improving this knight, moving it in closer towards my enemy's king. Let's do that. Okay, and black has decided to run away. So this is looking now a lot more promising. Now I'm going to move my queen up to f2, where if this bishop now captures, I could recapture with the queen, and that would have the king in check. That's not happened, so let's now threaten the bishop. Move my knight round again, attacking this bishop. You see, I want the action all to take place around that king's position. Okay, now let's come in with this knight. Okay, so I'm attacking the king and the rook and the knight. So the knight pretty much forced to take. Now I can recapture with my queen. Rooks come forwards. Okay, so now I look at all my pieces. What's not taking part in the game? Well, this rook on a1 has not yet moved and is still just stuck defending the back rank. So at this point in the game, now pieces have started to get swapped off, I might think about using my rooks better. So let's lift this rook from f1 to f3. Okay, that queen is not threatening me at all. And now I'm going to move my other rook across to f1. Now I've got a lot of material on this f-file. Okay, we've swapped off queens. Alright, and the knights come in. It's having a stab at this pawn, but I'm not concerned about this pawn. I've got checkmates on my mind. So now I'm going to use my knight. I'm going to eliminate that bishop. The king cannot recapture. Okay, so pawn's recaptured. I'm going to put my rook there now. Okay. And I thought black might exchange at that point, but no, it's not exchanged. So I'll capture. Black's king is forced to capture. My rook now comes in. You can see how I've got options in this game. Okay? And my king is still relatively safe. So now I'm in the driving seat. I can now start removing some of these pawns. And everything is pretty much safe. I could lose a pawn now on here, but that's not a huge concern, because I can just keep on grabbing my enemy's pawns. So I'm a pawn up at this point in time. Rooks come across to defend that pawn, so let's attack this pawn. Don't see anything wrong with that. Okay, knights start to come round. It could capture my bishop there, so shall I move my bishop? Yeah, let's move my bishop here with a double attack on the rook and this pawn. Okay. Let's capture. Now the rook could have captured this pawn here. Okay, but he hasn't. I have a free pawn here that I could take. Let's go ahead and grab that, shall we? Okay, rook's gone to there. And how do we finish off this king? This very vulnerable king in the corner. I just move up here and threaten another pawn. And let's grab the pawn. This king now, you see, because my rook is on the 7th rank, rooks love to be on that 7th rank, so this king actually now cannot move forwards into the board at all. So it's completely just tied up. Okay, I'm going to move my bishop here with check, and my idea is now to come back down here to protect my pawns. So now my pawns are really nice and safe. Okay, that rook can't take that pawn. Let's grab another pawn. That's not really an attack against my rook, because rooks are worth more than bishops, so I'm quite happy if he wants to capture that. No, he's moved back, but that pawn's still defended. Can you see now I'm just... life is just easier for me now. And it all started from the opening, because I developed my pieces more quickly than my opponent did. And now... move my rook back here, where it's attacking the knight. The knight could move. Okay, knight has moved. Now let's start thinking about making a queen. So I'm going to try and push one of my pawns up the board. I have several pawns. Okay, knight's come to there. It's attacking that pawn, but again it's defended. Right. So I've got nice coordination of my pieces. Everything's now defended. This bishop is defending 3 pawns from that nice square that he's got there. Alright, let's... now I can't push again. I suppose I can. Can push again. Alright, so I'm going to now engage my rook. So now I can bring my rook potentially behind the pawn there to protect it. Let's do that. The knight could move there and attack it, but it hasn't. Alright, and now bishop to d5 is now attacking the rook. So what's he going to do? Is the rook going to move? No, the rook's going to swap itself off for a pawn. And I have all this lovely scope on the board now. So here, move my rook here, has trapped the king into these two columns there. And now, this is a tactic. So I'm thinking of sacrificing my rook in return for free passage for my pawn. So now this pawn can just saunter up the board and become a queen. And that guarantees a win, really, unless I don't stalemate my opponent. Stalemate means that you leave your opponent in a position where he has no legal moves that he can make. So he's not in check and he can't move. And that is a draw in chess. Okay. Everything's coordinated very nicely. I'm going to push up another pawn because I can. So my dominance in pieces just led to this very easy situation where I could then just move around the board more freely than my opponent could and sweep up the pawns, leaving me with this big pawn majority and a nice, very easy checkmate. So there you go, that's your opening principles. If you need to, write them down, okay? So let's go back to the beginning. Occupy the center of the board, get your knights out, usually just before your bishops, but bishops can come out too, like this one. Okay, castle your king at any point during the opening. Sometimes you might want to wait until you've developed your other pieces and then decide where you want to castle. Other times you may want to castle earlier. Okay, defending a pawn and moving my dark squared pawn from here, which liberates this dark squared bishop onto this diagonal, which now comes out, pins the knight against the queen. A pawn move, which was unforced and unnecessary. Move my bishop back, another unforced pawn move. Now I develop my last minor piece, another pawn move, but it's not really threatening because my bishop can just move out of the way. Another pawn move. Now I simply move my knight back out of the way for now. Now my queen comes up, connecting my rooks, makes a king move. I move my king out of the way so that I can move this pawn. Another pawn move. Now I start, but this pawn move has a point. I'm trying to get rid of my pawn. I'm trying to swap it off so that I can open up attacking options towards that king. So I swap it off. There it goes. Queen has to move back. Now I attack the bishop. Bishop moves out of the way. Now my knight comes in. It's quite happy to swap itself off. Anything to clear up this area of the board is all going to be in my favour. Knight comes in again, threatening check now. Knight comes in with check. King is forced to move. Now my bishop moves back, facing off against black's dark square bishop, which is really black's only threat at the moment. Black decides not to initiate the exchange, but I do. I go in, grab, pawn recaptures. Slightly weakening black's pawns now. Now there's no pawn on this d file at all. And now I bring in my knight, thinking about swapping off more material. Black's not interested in that. Now my queen comes in, so now I want to bring in the big guns, the queens, rooks, towards the end of the game. Now the knight comes round, attacking this bishop. Rook maneuvers, knight comes in with check and a three-way fork, which forces black to have to swap off his knight. Now my queen comes in, now we're looking very dangerous. Rook lifts, preparing for the other rook. Queen comes across, now the queens are engaged. Double the rooks, queen takes, rook takes, okay, and then, sorry about the dogs. And now I take off his bishop, and we exchange off. Because I've got a small advantage. I've actually got no material advantage at this point because we've got the same number of pawns. However, the activity of my pieces and the arrangement of my pawns, see how safe my pawns are. And that's because I didn't make a load of pawn moves at the start of the game, whereas my opponent has moved pawns all over the place, right? Look where his pawns are. They're in a complete mess, right? And that's what allows me now just to start sweeping up pawns like shooting fish in a barrel, okay? There we go. And it's just simple. It's making life easier for myself in that part of the game. And it all came from solid opening principles. So there you go. So I hope that's useful for you if you're a beginner, or maybe you've picked up 1 or 2 tips if you're a more experienced player. But either way, if you haven't subscribed to Chess Bootcamp, please do subscribe, and so that you don't miss the material. And I hope this has been good for you. And thanks for watching. See you soon.